Paris, 1308. A 12-year-old girl stands before the altar of Boulogne Cathedral, her small hands trembling as she speaks vows that will seal her fate forever. 8 kings and queens witness this union, a political chess move disguised as holy matrimony. The bride's name is Isabella of France. The groom, 24 years older, is Edward II of England. Neither knows that this moment will unleash a chain of events so catastrophic that it will forever change English history. For this child bride will grow into something her husband never anticipated, a woman with the cunning of a serpent and the ruthlessness of a wolf. This is the story of how a neglected queen became England's most dangerous woman, how love turned to hatred, how humiliation bred vengeance, and how one woman's fury would topple a king and reshape a kingdom. Born around 1295 to Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, Isabella was no ordinary princess. Her father was one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, a man who had humbled popes and crushed the Knights Templar. Her mother, Joan of Navarre, ruled her own kingdom with an iron fist. Isabella grew up in the most sophisticated court in Europe. While other noble daughters learned needlework, Isabella mastered languages, politics, and the deadly art of court intrigue. She could read, a rare skill for women, and collected books like weapons, each one expanding her intellectual arsenal. But nothing could prepare her for the humiliation awaiting her in England. The marriage contract was signed in blood and gold. Isabella would bring peace between France and England, her body the bridge between 2 warring kingdoms. But there was something the French negotiators didn't know, something that would poison this union from its very first day. Edward II was already in love, not with his bride, but with a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. February 25th, 1308, Westminster Abbey. The coronation should have been the most glorious day of Isabella's life. Instead, it became her first taste of systematic humiliation. As Isabella knelt receiving England's crown, her husband's attention was elsewhere. Piers Gaveston, elevated to Earl of Cornwall, a title reserved for royal blood, wore robes more magnificent than the king's own. The wedding gifts Philip IV had sent for his daughter, Edward had already given them to his favorite. The French delegation was scandalized. Isabella's uncles watched in horror as their niece was publicly humiliated on what should have been her triumph. But Isabella said nothing. At 12, she had already learned the first rule of survival: watch, wait, and remember everything. For 4 years, Isabella lived in strange limbo. Queen of England in name, but little more than a decorative prisoner, Edward showered Gaveston with lands and affection while his wife remained in shadows, producing no heirs, wielding no influence. But Isabella was learning English politics, learning which nobles resented Gaveston, learning how to write letters that said one thing while meaning another. Most importantly, she was learning how to hate. The breaking point came in 1312. English barons, led by Edward's cousin Thomas of Lancaster, captured Gaveston and executed him like a common criminal. Edward was devastated, raging and weeping for weeks. But Isabella felt something new: hope. With Gaveston dead, perhaps her husband would finally turn to her. She was wrong. By 1320, 2 new favorites emerged: Hugh Despenser the Elder and his son. If Gaveston had been arrogant, the Despensers were rapacious. The younger Despenser possessed an almost supernatural hold over Edward, systematically isolating him from nobles, advisors, and most crucially, from his queen. In 1324, the final humiliation came. Using war with France as excuse, Edward confiscated all Isabella's lands and income. The Queen of England was reduced to living on 8 marks daily, barely enough for a minor noble. Worse, Edward removed her 3 youngest children from her care, placing them under Hugh Despenser's wife. For 16 years, Isabella had endured neglect, humiliation, and isolation. She had watched her husband lavish affection on favorites while treating her like an unwanted burden. She had seen her children taken, her income stolen, her identity as queen systematically destroyed. But Hugh Despenser had made one fatal mistake. He had left her alive. 1325. War between England and France provided Isabella with an opportunity she had waited 17 years to seize. When Pope John XXII suggested the Queen might mediate between her husband and brother Charles IV, Isabella volunteered immediately. On March 9, 1325, Isabella set sail for France. She would never return as Edward's queen. In Paris, Isabella was welcomed as a returning princess. Her brother received her with honors due a daughter of France. For the first time in 2 decades, Isabella was treated with respect her birth demanded. But respect wasn't enough. Isabella wanted revenge. The French court was filled with English exiles, men who had fled Edward's tyranny. Among them was Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March. Mortimer was everything Edward wasn't. Where Edward was weak, Mortimer was strong. Where Edward was indecisive, Mortimer was ruthless. And unlike Edward, Mortimer saw Isabella not as an inconvenience, but as a weapon. By winter 1325, Isabella and Mortimer's alliance was an open secret. Isabella played her part perfectly, dressing in widow's clothes and declaring someone had come between her and her husband, clearly referencing Despenser. She refused Edward's desperate demands to return, protected by her brother's declaration that she was free to remain in France. But Isabella's masterstroke came when Edward sent their 13-year-old son to perform homage for English territories. Isabella refused to let the boy return. Now she held the ultimate card, the heir to England's throne. The trap was set. Now Isabella needed an army. The Count of Hainault was practical. When Isabella proposed marriage between her son and his daughter Philippa in exchange for military support, he saw opportunity. By September 1326, Isabella had assembled 700 mercenaries and a fleet. On September 24, 1326, Isabella's ships appeared off Suffolk's coast. As her forces landed at Orwell, something extraordinary happened. Instead of resistance, they found welcome. The English people, crushed by Despenser tyranny, saw Isabella not as invader, but as liberator. Edward's collapse was breathtaking. Within weeks, his support evaporated. Town after town opened gates. Noble after noble declared for the Queen. Even the church proclaimed support for Isabella's cause. The Despensers, so powerful months before, were now hunted fugitives. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured at Bristol and executed with medieval brutality, hanged, drawn, and quartered while alive. Edward himself fled toward Wales, but found no sanctuary. On November 16, 1326, the former King of England was captured and brought before his wife in chains. The woman who had knelt before him as a 12-year-old bride now held his life in her hands. Isabella had achieved something unprecedented. She had successfully invaded England and deposed a reigning king, the first woman to accomplish such a feat through her own cunning and determination. January 20th, 1327. Edward II formally abdicated in favor of his 14-year-old son, but even in defeat, Edward remained dangerous. As long as he lived, he would rally opposition to the new regime. On September 21st, 1327, Edward II died in Berkeley Castle. Official cause, natural causes. But rumors immediately circulated of a death so brutal, so symbolically cruel, that it would haunt Isabella forever. Whether Isabella ordered her husband's murder or merely allowed it, she had crossed an irreversible line. She was no longer just a queen reclaiming her throne. She was a regicide who had destroyed the sacred bond between monarch and subject. For 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England in young Edward III's name. They accumulated vast wealth, made humiliating peace with Scotland, and governed with increasingly heavy hands. The woman once powerless now wielded absolute authority. But absolute power breeds absolute enemies. October 19th, 1330, Nottingham Castle. Isabella, now 35, and at power's height, retired with Mortimer, unaware her own son was moving against them. Edward III, 18 and chafing under his mother's control, had decided to claim his birthright. Using a secret passage, his supporters burst into Isabella's chamber and seized Mortimer. Isabella's desperate cry echoed through the castle. "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The boy she had fought to protect had become the man who would destroy her power. Mortimer was executed for treason a month later. Isabella, spared only because she was the king's mother, was stripped of lands and confined to Castle Rising. The woman who had commanded armies was reduced to living on a pension. Her political career ended forever. Isabella lived 28 more years after her fall, dying peacefully at Hertford Castle on August 22, 1358. She was buried in her wedding dress, the same gown worn as a 12-year-old bride, with Edward II's heart placed upon her chest. It was a gesture speaking to her character's complexity. Despite everything, some part of Isabella had never stopped being Edward's wife. History has judged Isabella harshly, branding her the she-wolf of France. Victorian historians, uncomfortable with a woman wielding such devastating power, painted her as a scheming adulteress who destroyed her husband from spite and lust. But this narrative ignores fundamental truth. Isabella wasn't born a monster. She was created by a system treating women as property, by a husband who humiliated her for 17 years, and by a court that stripped away everything making life worth living. Modern historians have begun reassessing Isabella's legacy, recognizing her not as villain, but as a woman trapped in an impossible situation who found strength to fight back. Her invasion wasn't just personal vendetta, it was political revolution, establishing crucial precedents for limiting royal power. Edward II's deposition marked the first time an English king was formally removed by Parliament. This precedent would echo through centuries, contributing to Charles I's execution and constitutional monarchy's development. Isabella's rebellion helped establish that even kings were subject to law. But perhaps Isabella's greatest legacy lies in the example she set for future generations of women. In an age when women were expected to be silent and powerless, Isabella proved that intelligence and determination could overcome overwhelming odds. Today, visitors to Hertford Castle can walk through rooms where Isabella spent her final days. But her true monument isn't built of stone. It lives in every woman who has refused to accept injustice, who has fought back against oppression, who has dared to claim power in a world that would deny it. The little girl forced into loveless marriage at 12 became the woman who proved even queens could be warriors. The neglected wife stripped of children and dignity became the conqueror who reshaped a kingdom. Isabella of France was many things: wife, mother, queen, regent, conqueror, exile. She was capable of great love and terrible vengeance, of strategic brilliance and ruthless calculation. She was fully human, with all the complexity and capacity for both creation and destruction that humanity entails. But most importantly, she was dangerous. Dangerous to systems seeking to silence women. Dangerous to men believing power was their birthright alone. Dangerous to anyone thinking birth, gender, or circumstance could determine human potential's limits. In the end, Isabella achieved something few rulers ever accomplish. She changed the world. Not through conquest or commerce, but through sheer force of her refusal to be broken. She was forced into a loveless marriage as a child. She endured 17 years of humiliation. She was stripped of her children, income, and dignity. And in response, she became England's most dangerous queen.